What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. To my mind, the metagame has sort of stagnated. There are a group of 5 or 6 decks that are just pretty clearly the best things to be doing, and once you get outside of that group, you're very much taking potentially a losing angle against some and a winning angle against others. On the other hand, having 5 or 6 top decks to choose from isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world, and there are a lot of variations among them, but one of the decks that's been the most constant, both in terms of showing up near the top and having very few variations, is, of course, the stick-based Captain Carter combo list. This list has one flex slot. You can play Absorbing Man over Silver Surfer, you can play Galactus over Silver Surfer, you can play Wolverine Horseman of War over Silver Surfer. Really, whatever it is you want to be doing in that slot, you can do pretty reasonably, but I think most of the time, the other 11 cards are going to be doing most of the winning for you. This is the deck with the highest ceiling in the game, the most total output, and it is notably particularly disruptible. Decks that are playing things like Cosmic Ghost Rider and Shadow King can put the kibosh on your combo before you start actually pulling it off. That is dangerous, but the output is so massive. I'll just come out here and say it. People are still too low on Multiple Man, and Multiple Man is the core of a deck that can arguably be described as, if not the best deck in the game, one of the best decks in the game. The Multiple Man combo list is built to combine Multiple Man with other things that make it larger and give it the ability to move. Penny Parker's Spider is perhaps the best one of these, but functionally, this is basically playing like a Phoenix Force list that doesn't have to jump through nearly as many hoops to get a repeatably movable 9-power Multiple Man. Then it also, because of that, gets to play better interaction, cards like Cosmo and Juggernaut. I think this list is by far the single most underrated list at the larger population of Marvel Snap. You see it a lot at High Infinite, but you don't see it a lot everywhere else, and some of that is that it is difficult to play and difficult to order, but there is so much power in here and so much powerful interaction that it's hard for me to believe that dedicating some time to figuring out how this list works will not be something that is worth doing for anyone of any skill level. It is unbelievably powerful and can play its way out of a bunch of different matchups. That said, it is also a deck that has an open 12th card slot. Here it's being used on Spider-Punk. Spider-Punk is a fine thing in this context. It's just an additional thing that you can put some buffs on and try to win a lane with, but it's way, way worse than the ones that are actually good, Human Torch and Multiple Man. There are a couple different approaches to Batroc move, and both of them emphasize a few different things, but both arrive from the same place. The first thing to understand about Batroc move is there's about 6 or 7 cards that go in every version of Batroc move, and then you can kind of mess around with the rest of them. That is the fundamental thing that really matters to this archetype. There are only so many cards that are actually good in it. Spider-Man and Batroc at the 1, Silk, Sam, and Kraven at the 2, and Hydra Stomper at the 3. Those are the cards that represent the core. From there, you have a couple of options. What do you want to do with your remaining 6 slots? Interaction cards like Juggernaut and Cosmo are very viable, but one thing that's really important in a metagame like this is having some guys that are actually big so you don't get obliterated by Gambit Horsemen of Death. That's why this list from Sizer has a bunch of large men in it that you should hopefully be able to get value out of and win the game against those Gambit decks, even when they're getting things that obliterate your scalers. This is a deck that's trying to adapt to one of its strongest predators, the decks that spam Gambit Horsemen of Death, and in so doing is getting larger and larger and larger, with the theory being that if I just have enough really big guys that fundamentally cannot be interacted with by Gambit Horsemen of Death, I can just win that matchup anyway because they're just not going to have enough points to do what they need to do. And it does require a bit of a change, and it is notable that this is a deck that is being forced to do this by metagame context, not necessarily being in this configuration naturally, but I will say it is notable that Batroc itself, this shell, really only has 6 cards, and you can kind of go whatever direction you want building off of those 6 cards. It's a very flexible and powerful shell. As an example, the Paraguay move list that I've covered previously on this channel is a very solid other option for if you want to try a different direction here. This is saying instead of trying to beat my worst matchup, I'm going to try to become someone else's worst matchup. We have all of these tech cards in here. You might think that this is a thing that just simply doesn't have the points to win the game, but I've seen it do it, and I've played it doing it. This is a deck that really does need Sam Wilson on 2 in order to really start rolling downhill, but you don't need to roll that far downhill to start slamming tech cards and locking your opponents out of the game. This is definitely a fun police deck, and you should be aware of that, but luckily for this deck as a fun police deck, there is one other deck in the metagame that is even more policing fun than this is. And that, of course, is, if we're being honest, any deck involving a lot of Gambit Horsemen of Death, but especially this one. Notable flex slot here, Scarlet Witch, can be whatever you really want it to be to deal with things that happen to beat you. Scarlet Witch just happens to be the cheaper one, and I tend to be a bit of a slave to making my curves make more sense. So while Mercury may be a better card, we still have Scarlet Witch in the list. This is a list that is built around copying things that stop your opponents from doing anything, whether that be copying Shadow Kings in matchups against Venus decks, or copying things like Gambit in matchups against Craven decks, or copying things like Gambit in matchups against anyone who's playing cards that don't cost more than 3. There's a lot to be said for a list like this. I do think that over time, it's become clear that these lists are much less Victoria Hand lists and much more Gambit and Tech lists. Victoria Hand is fine, and it's nice to have another thing that you want to copy, but she's not winning any games on her own at this point. She's supplementing your tech cards as an ability to get enough points on the board that your tech cards can carry you to the win. I'd go so far as to say she's actually probably a worse supplement to tech cards than the Batroc stuff is. It's just that she comes alongside Gambit Horseman of Death, who's probably a little bit better. Those two are what this deck is built around, and having just the ability to say so much of what your opponent did during the game just never happened is a very powerful thing to do. Now, me personally, if I'm going to be playing a Victoria Hand deck, it's usually going to be this one because I just find it a decent amount more compelling. There's a flex spot here too. It's actually Gambit 1. This Gambit is fine, but sometimes he can block you from actually hitting a Sasquatch here. So it depends on how invested you want to be in a Sasquatch, right? Because the flex spot is basically, do you want to play the Gambit because he's good, or do you want to play a Majestic Wingbeat to go alongside your Sasquatch? The Wingbeat gives you a much stronger nut draw. The Gambit gives you a much more powerful mid-roll and conflicts with your nut draw a reasonable amount. I think this is kind of a judgment call. You can choose whichever direction you want to go. One is directly synergistic with your nut draw, the other is directly anti-synergistic with your nut draw, but in the world where it's kind of difficult to actually get to your nut draw, I can totally understand why it might be a little bit difficult to actually try to play this version with the other configuration. Definitely the kind of thing you have to be thinking about the entire game, and it can be a little bit problematic. Unhelpful Yoda has been playing a lot of Cerebro 3 in High Infinite, and I've gained a pretty healthy respect for this list, which pretty often can get to 3 Cerebros, but also pretty often can do things like play a Scarlet Witch on a problematic lane, figure that Scarlet Witch, and if necessary, even get a third copy of that Scarlet Witch thanks to Bastion. Because of that, when you actually have Scarlet Witch, having access to effectively multiple copies of it makes it a very resilient Cerebro deck against a lot of different situations. One of the biggest things that people struggle with Cerebro decks is those locations, and this is the Cerebro deck that has the most ability to change the most locations in a match. Now, this is also a deck that is pretty one note. It is, like every Cerebro deck, playing a bunch of very mediocre cards that do very mediocre stuff. If you find yourself running out of guys, swapping Gorgon for a card like Sentinel could be a very viable direction to go, as well as Quake, who is sort of your backup Scarlet Witch if you actually need to really get out of something, and Quake can help you do it. It's rare, but it can happen. Other than that, this is a list that plays your typical Cerebro 3 game plan. A bunch of cards that are never going to see play outside of a Cerebro 3 deck that you're only really playing because that's how the deck functions. It's interesting how to talk about each of the Cerebro lists in here, because in my ban list tournament, Cerebro 5 won, but I'm not very confident that I would recommend it to be played on ladder because of the context of being that we banned the 4 best decks. This being a bit of a different kind of deck, a bit of a more adapted to the current environment deck, does make me feel like I'd rather be playing Cerebro 3 on ladder at the current moment, despite the fact that Cerebro 5 won my tournament. That said, Cerebro 5 plays a lot more cards that are actually good than Cerebro 3 has ever done or will ever have the ability to dream of doing, just by the nature of the cards that you have to include in decks like this in order to facilitate the game plan. Sometimes I do special callouts in lists like this for a deck that I think is good if you are someone who does not play a ton of Marvel Snap or does not pay a ton of attention to the meta or just wants to play something simple, straightforward, and easy. And I think right now that deck is Aurora. Aurora is a really simple, really straightforward, really easy, really powerful list that if you're like, I would like to climb to Infinite and I'm rank 85, I think this is kind of the list that I would recommend to you. The only real thinking you have to do is just think about what your Aurora lanes are going to look like over the course of the game. You just sort of sit there and you're like, oh, this lane already has an end of turn in it. I'll put the other one in there. This is also a good shell for Tarantula, but if you don't have Tarantula, you're looking at Herbie in that spot. Just something with the abilities that actually key off of Aurora here. That's really the only requirement you're looking for. Venus has added such a high ceiling to this list, and it is one of the best Iska decks in the entire game. This is a straightforward, easy to play, and powerful list that I think, if anything, is a deck that might even be able to replace a Thing for Steps with a Cosmic Ghost Rider and maybe improve a little bit. I do find that Thing for Steps is a less than perfect answer to a lot of stuff that I actually maybe would prefer Cosmic Ghost Rider. We'll see how that swap goes along, but I do think it's worth calling that one out here. You can also do things like get a Mercury in here in place of a Drax if you're worried about certain matchups against move-oriented decks. There's a lot of flexibility in this list, and it sort of plays like the old school Spectrum tech lists where you can move things in and out depending on what you're looking at in this metagame. And I do think there's some real upside in doing something like this. One of the things I've been really impressed with Zombie Galacti builds recently is that they have enough green power in them that Superior Spider-Man is just on all the time. And I really like decks like this when they don't have to rely on magic. So when I saw this list performing pretty well, I was really excited because for once we actually get to play a Zombie Galacti deck that doesn't make me incredibly sad thinking about the amount of times I've been magicked for a robbery of 8 cubes. And I think just removing that from this deck's profile is really important. But in order to do that, we need other ways of ramping too. So we have Hope Summers in here as a method of making sure that we're going to have enough energy to actually play the Zombie Galacti. This is a deck that does some legitimately powerful stuff when it stacks up its buffs the way that it wants to. And I remain convinced that if this deck is ever going to seriously succeed, it's going to do so without magic in it. So every time I have the chance to play a version that doesn't have magic in it, that's what feels like actually pushing the archetype forward. Whereas relying on magic consigns it to being just another magic deck, and that is not a space that I think will ever arrive at this deck being the best deck in the game, which should be the goal of anyone who plays any deck, really, is how do I get this to a point where I can honestly believe it's a top tier deck, where it's one of the best decks in the game. And I just don't think that's going to happen for Galacti as long as it's a magic deck, personally. So I always default to lists that look more like this. Supergiant is just a straight up good deck. There's really nothing else I can say about it. Supergiant and Fantomex are twins in my mind, where there's just, yep, this is good. I see nothing wrong with anything that you're doing here. Straightforward, good, powerful list that does straightforward, good, powerful things. You disrupt your opponent pretty dramatically. You make your opponent feel bad for trying to do things that require things like turn 5 and on reveal abilities and the cards I played to stay on the board. And then if you beat them by making sure that those things they were counting on to happen don't happen, then you get to point at them and laugh and go, ha, 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 ha. But I do feel like Supergiant's a pretty intimidating deck to be good with, and an especially intimidating deck to snap with, because when you win by very small margins, and a lot of your decisions are very up in the air and read requirement. It is a very, very difficult deck to play. Fantomex, much the same, just doing disruption in a bit of a different way. Very powerful list that has a ton of ability to output points that are particularly efficient, if a little bit finicky. This is sort of the name of the game here. Fantomex is asking you to do more stuff than most decks to get efficient stat sticks, but those stat sticks are so efficient and so cheap that you can do a lot of stuff around them. It's one of the few decks that can afford to play as many tech cards as this, and the amount of relevant tech that it gets to play, combined with the amount of power it gets from its stat sticks, Wild Child, Fantomex, even a Bucky Barnes is well above rate. I mean, if you look at Marrow, that's effectively a free 7 power, stature eat your heart out. Like, there's just kind of a lot of free value happening here that you are banking on in order to justify the rest of what you're doing. You're trying to drag your opponent's combo down into the mud, and because you've dragged your opponent's combo down into the mud, I mean, that sucks for them, but you're going to beat them because your stat sticks are better than theirs. If you're particularly worried about Gambit decks, one way to do some remarkably powerful stuff against them is to have most of your effective power residing on their side of the board. Clog is particularly good against Victoria hand decks because they struggle very heavily with putting points on the board in terms of verticality per space. So taking away spaces is an extremely potent way of denying them output. These are decks that can very often fill up most of the board anyway, so the amount of space that you're denying them is space they're actually going to use. And so you get a deck that is just able to do some really powerful stuff like Clog that can do strong stuff while not necessarily getting its scalars, quote unquote, obliterated. You also get to play armor in here, goes along with White Widow, so you have a bunch of ability to do various tech-related things. This is still a Shadow King Mercury deck, for example. Send over some stuff, clog them up, play some guys, and Iska is just a godsend here. Just a card that you can slap down on turn 4 and actually win a lane with. You need that so badly in a deck like this that is so often bereft of lane winners. Just a really powerful card in this context, and I think this deck perhaps a little bit underrated. Not necessarily one of the greatest things you could be doing, but there's a lot that it can do in a metagame like this. I've been seeing a little bit of tricky Galactus Nimrod stuff recently. I'm pretty impressed with it in the sense that, like, it's far from as bad as many would have you believe. There's just like a pretty straightforward mix-up here of being able to go Spider-Man, and then they're like, oh my god, I need to like go invest and win that lane, and then that lane ends up being like a Black Panther Zola lane. Like, yes, you lose to Cosmo, yes, you lose to Juggernaut, but just having some really straightforward, here's a big guy, here's another big guy kind of game plans. I think this deck ends up putting itself in 50-50s a lot, and it's not that bad to be in 50-50s. There's some really cool tricks you can pull off with this deck, like magic into a turn 6 Galactus, blowing up the magic. There's just stuff, right? And I think there's just nice things that this deck can do, some really strong 50-50 style gameplay that feels very, yes or no. Did you have it? Did I read you correctly? Did you read me correctly? It's a fun list in that sense. It really turns the game into a game between two people rather than a game that is defined by the cards, which is, a good thing and a bad thing depending on what you think about it. But it's definitely a fun exercise to play a deck like this in a world where so many other things are defined by small interactions between things. This is a deck that's defined by enormous, ginormous interactions between things. Last up, I reiterate that this is probably the most fun deck in Marvel Snap. Some form of this is just an absolute blast to play. I wish I had a better thing than Ramatut to be doing here, but Infinity Ultron isn't better, which is damning to Infinity Ultron, and I don't really have a good option for cool card I'd like to play that just does big stuff as a 4-drop, so Ramatut it is, and that leaves us with a bit of a hole in this deck because what this deck actually does powerfully is double stuff, like having Wong and then allowing Wong to hit Mother Ascani or Mother Ascani Prodigy gives us a bunch of Lady Bullseyes. Really cool stuff happens that way, a bunch of Gambits, a bunch of skills from the Agamotto that go on top of the Wong, a bunch of extra energy. That's what the ethos of this deck is, right? And Ramatut fits that, but man, I wish I had something that was just doing something a little bit better. Now, you might have noticed I've been a little stiff during this video. That's because I somehow injured my back and neck during the KMBest Block Party number 3. I find it pretty difficult to bend it much right now. It'll get better. I've done this before, But yeah, that's what's going on. If you're like, why does KM look so weird? What's up with the angle? It's because I'm jamming my back against the heating pad here and trying to keep my neck as straight as possible and not turn it much. I'm normally, I think, pretty expressive with my head movements, and I don't think there's been a lot of that in this video, so that's what's going on. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I hope this doesn't happen to you. Have a wonderful evening and happy snapping. Stole that one from Cozy.